First story, trapped in the backrooms. In a dimly lit laboratory, a group of scientists watched a monitor with a flickering live feed of the backrooms, an endless maze-like structure rumored to hold countless levels, each more unsettling than the last. This time, they were not merely observing. They had a new test subject, Mark, whom they had lured with the promise of a high-paying research job. Mark had no idea he was their unwitting participant, and as he signed the contract, he unknowingly consented to the horrors awaiting him. The last thing he remembered was being led into a decompression chamber for routine tests, but when he woke, he was in the backrooms. Dull yellow walls stretched endlessly, bathed in the buzz of flickering fluorescent lights. His heart raced as he took in the smell of mold and dust, a nightmare come to life. Every turn seemed the same, yet slightly different, as if the walls themselves shifted just beyond his view. Mark wandered, desperate to find an exit, but the scientists had disabled all possible escape routes. For them, Mark was a subject to study. How long could he survive each level? How would he respond to the terror? On level 2, the walls pulsed with a slow, rhythmic hum, and he felt a constant presence, something lurking in the shadows just beyond the light. His breaths grew ragged as the sounds intensified, whispers that seemed to crawl out of the walls themselves. He wanted to run, but the maze felt endless, and exhaustion began to settle into his bones. Each new level brought new horrors. Level 5 presented a grand, decaying hotel with endless corridors, where every door led to another, eerier part of the maze. Muffled jazz music echoed through the hallways, yet every room was empty and felt inhabited by a forgotten presence. The scientists recorded every reaction, but Mark couldn't know they were watching his terror unfold. The true nature of their experiment lay in observing his mental breakdown, each level designed to test his limits. They whispered amongst themselves, discussing his resilience, making notes on his erratic breathing, his quickening pulse, and the way fear distorted his reality. By level 7, an endless flooded cavern, Mark had nearly lost hope. The cold water lapped at his knees, and creatures lurked beneath the surface, unseen but felt, a terrifying sensation as he tried to wade through. Whispers in his mind told him this was the end, that he'd never escape, and his senses started to blur. Was this madness, or something more sinister lurking in the backrooms? In a final act of defiance, he screamed, calling for help, his voice echoing against the walls. The scientists, watching from their screens, only saw a man on the brink, teetering between reality and delusion. For them, this was success. For Mark, it was the final descent into the unending nightmare. Yet something happened that they didn't foresee. In his despair, Mark began to understand the shifting maze, recognizing patterns, whispers that led him rather than deterred him. He disappeared from their view, evading every camera. The scientists searched frantically, but Mark had broken free, becoming part of the backrooms itself, a shadow that would haunt their every experiment from that day forward, waiting, lurking, a vengeful presence for the next soul they dared to send inside. Second story, breaking out of the backrooms. Lucas had been searching for his brother, Mark, for months. Mark's disappearance had been sudden, leaving no trace, just the distant memory of a job interview with a company he refused to name. Sleepless nights consumed Lucas, scouring records, police reports, and the last locations Mark had been spotted. Friends dismissed it as a wild chase, but Lucas could not let go. His instincts told him that Mark was alive, trapped somewhere beyond ordinary reach. One day, Lucas found an unexpected clue, a crumpled business card in a forgotten box of Mark's belongings. It bore the logo of a covert scientific research lab, ominously vague, with an address to a location he'd never heard of. Driven by hope and a fierce resolve, Lucas dug deeper, tracking the company's web of secrecy, noticing that others had gone missing under similar circumstances. They called themselves the Nexus Institute. Certain he'd found his lead, Lucas decided to infiltrate. He spent weeks preparing a false identity as a research analyst to apply for a position at Nexus. It was only when he received the confirmation email that he felt both the thrill and terror of how far he was willing to go. This wasn't just about finding his brother. He wanted revenge on those who had stolen him away. Once inside, Lucas found himself in a labyrinth of cold, sterile hallways. He kept his head down, playing the part, biding his time. It was during one late-night shift that he overheard two senior researchers discussing the Backrooms project, referring to it as an experiment in dimensional exposure. His stomach tightened as he realized what they were saying. They were trapping people in alternate realms, using them as subjects to test psychological endurance in a seemingly infinite maze. Lucas's heart raced, but he kept his composure. He couldn't act rashly. He needed to understand their security, their protocols, their weaknesses. For weeks, he played the dutiful employee by day, but at night, he navigated restricted areas, hacking into files, learning the layout of the facility, and marking every entry point. The deeper he dug, the more he uncovered the horrifying reality. Test subjects, including Mark, were trapped in a place called the Backrooms, a pocket dimension created by Nexus for their twisted research. With every discovery, Lucas grew more enraged. He knew he had to act soon. His heart pounded as he devised a plan to bring down the entire project, but he was haunted by one question. Could Mark still be alive in that hellish place? On a stormy night, Lucas put his plan into motion. First, he hacked the system, setting off alarms in every wing of the building. Panic erupted as staff scattered, some heading for the exits, others to emergency control rooms. Lucas slipped into the main lab, where he initiated a complete shutdown of the Backrooms access grid. His goal was twofold: to destabilize the system Nexus used to trap people and, if possible, to create an opening, however brief, for Mark to escape. As the security alerts blared, Lucas donned a lab coat, slipping undetected into the observation room. The screen showed grainy footage of different levels in the Backrooms, each with dimly lit, endless corridors. His eyes scanned the screens, desperately searching for his brother. Just when he was about to give up, he saw him, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes, moving steadily through the endless maze. It was Mark. Ignoring the risks, Lucas activated the emergency override, opening a temporary pathway out of the Backrooms. On the screen, Mark froze, as if he sensed the shift. Lucas whispered, hoping his brother could hear him. "Mark, it's me. Run toward the light. I'm here." Mark moved, slowly at first, then sprinting. Lucas watched, breath held, as his brother neared the exit. But at that moment, two security guards burst into the room, realizing what Lucas was doing. In a frantic rush, Lucas locked the door and continued pressing buttons, desperate to keep the path open. His heart raced as the guards banged on the glass, but he didn't care. This was his chance to save his brother. Finally, with one last effort, Mark reached the exit and stumbled into the lab. Lucas barely had time to react as Mark collapsed in his arms, exhausted but alive. The guards broke through, but before they could lay a hand on either of them, Lucas triggered his final act of defiance, a data wipe and an overload of the Backrooms access grid, causing an irreversible shutdown. The entire facility shuddered as alarms wailed and power surged. Lucas helped Mark to his feet, and together they ran, dodging panicked scientists and guards until they finally escaped into the night. The Nexus Institute fell silent behind them, its dark project in ruins. They walked for hours in silence, the dawn breaking over the horizon. Mark looked at his brother, tears in his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you. You saved me." Lucas smiled, gripping his brother's shoulder, knowing that the nightmare was over. But as they walked, a chilling thought lingered in Lucas's mind. The Backrooms, they could never be truly destroyed. Third story, The Digital Descent. The Liminal Seekers were a tight-knit group of online explorers who bonded over their fascination with the hidden corners of the internet. They'd spent countless nights unraveling obscure mysteries, sifting through digital myths, and exposing hoaxes. Yet, no mystery captivated them quite like the legend of the Backrooms. Unlike other urban legends, this one had an unnerving consistency across forums and testimonies, and each member of the Seekers felt a strange pull toward it, as if some invisible force wanted them to look closer. One evening, while scrolling a darknet forum, a member named Sam stumbled upon a thread marked Nexus B, Blueprints of the Infinite. The post contained encrypted files claiming to be official documents on the Backrooms, a detailed layout of corridors, levels, and references to entities lurking in the maze. The seekers, intrigued, immediately set to work on decrypting the files, laughing and exchanging theories about what they might find. But as they made progress, a chilling realization crept in. These files were too detailed to be part of any hoax. The last file they unlocked was unlike the others. As they clicked on it, each of their screens flashed with a message. "You've entered. Now, IT enters you." And then, the files vanished. At first, they brushed it off as a clever gimmick, an elaborate ending to the files trail. But later that night, Sam noticed something strange. He was alone in his dimly lit apartment when he saw it, a flickering fluorescent light in the hallway outside his room. His heart skipped as he stared, recalling descriptions from the Backrooms files they had decrypted earlier. Shaking off the chill, he laughed it off, blaming his imagination. The following night, another member, Jamie, heard a faint buzzing in her apartment. It started softly, then grew louder until it was all she could hear, as if her apartment walls were alive with some unseen presence. She turned on every light in the house, but no matter what room she entered, the buzzing seemed to follow her. And she swore she saw a yellow-tinted stain spreading across her wallpaper, just like the damp walls in the Backrooms. In their group chat, the seekers began sharing their experiences, laughing nervously about the strange coincidences. But as the days passed, the occurrences grew more intense and terrifying. Mark saw shadows moving in his peripheral vision, flickering in and out like figures trapped in the edges of his reality. Emma reported seeing patterns of the Backrooms maze on her ceiling, appearing like faint stains only to vanish when she looked directly at them. Desperation grew in the group, and Sam proposed they meet in person to discuss what was happening. They agreed to gather in an abandoned warehouse, hoping it would be private and far from their homes. When they arrived, however, they were shocked to find that the interior of the warehouse felt familiar. Yellow walls and that now too familiar buzzing echoed around them. Panic set in as the seekers realized they had stepped into a perfect recreation of the Backrooms. But how? The place was supposed to be a legend, a digital maze that couldn't reach them in the real world, could it? Sam, feeling responsible for starting this, led the way, trying to calm his friends. They moved through the hallways together, whispering and shuffling, their eyes darting to every corner. They tried doors, but each one opened into another identical corridor, sometimes bending at odd angles or disappearing into a shadow too dark to see through. Hours seemed to pass, and they grew exhausted, each of them sinking deeper into the unsettling feeling that they might never leave. At one point, Jamie dared to check her phone, and to her horror, realized they were still connected to the internet, but all their accounts were locked. Their usernames had been replaced by unknown symbols, and an unfamiliar account sent a message on their chat app. "Welcome to the other side. You belong to the Backrooms now." Mark's hand shook as he stared at his screen. "This has to be a trick. It has to be," he muttered, trying to convince himself even as his voice wavered. They decided to backtrack, each of them feeling as if they were being watched. They began to hear faint footsteps behind them, and every so often, the flicker of a shadow would dart around a corner just out of sight. A muffled groan echoed down the hall, making them freeze in their tracks. The files they had uncovered had described entities lurking in certain levels, but none of them had wanted to believe it. Driven by fear and adrenaline, Sam led them back the way they came, hoping to find an exit, but the hallways were shifting, closing off routes they'd taken only minutes before. Each step felt heavier, as if the maze itself were pulling them deeper. Mark, who had been at the back of the group, let out a cry as he was yanked back by an unseen force disappearing into the shadows. His terrified scream echoed through the hallways, then cut off suddenly, leaving an unnatural silence. Desperate, Emma broke into a sprint, her only thought to escape, to wake up from this nightmare. But as she ran, she realized the halls weren't ending. Every turn brought her to another endless yellow corridor, as if the maze had become infinite. She stopped, breathless and defeated, collapsing against the wall. Sam and Jamie found her moments later, and the three clung together, their terror settling into a grim acceptance. They understood now the Backrooms had crossed over, using their digital obsession as a bridge. And as they sat there trembling in the endless corridors, their phones buzzed in unison with the final message, "There is no way out." As the lights around them dimmed, the buzzing grew louder, drowning out their thoughts, and the shadows crept closer, consuming them one by one. Fourth story, The Backrooms Whisper. Ethan Moore had worked at Nexus Labs for over 5 years. He'd gotten used to the tight security, the long hours, and the corporate secrecy. The paycheck was good, and he didn't ask questions. In a place like Nexus, it was better not to know. All he needed to do was monitor the surveillance feeds, log data on project subjects, and run regular system diagnostics. The only strange thing was the project he was assigned to, codenamed the Backrooms. It was just endless corridors and shadows. His job didn't make sense, but he didn't mind until the messages started. One night, as he was wrapping up his shift, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number with a single message. "I know you can see me, Ethan. Please, help me." He frowned, wondering if it was a prank. Ignoring it, he shut down his station and went home. But when he arrived the next morning, another message was waiting for him, this time on his work monitor. It read, "Ethan, they're watching you. You have to get me out." Shaken, Ethan checked the surveillance feeds and ran a system scan, trying to find any sign of intrusion. The cameras showed the usual, a maze of dull yellow corridors with flickering lights, occasionally broken by the blurry outline of test subjects wandering aimlessly. But something felt off. The camera feed in one of the sectors flickered to reveal a shadowed figure staring directly into the lens. Ethan's heart pounded as he recognized something familiar in the figure's expression, but he couldn't place it. Over the next few days, the messages continued. Each time, the stranger seemed to know more about him. Details that no one else could. "Ethan, remember your sister's accident? They can make it happen again." He froze at his desk. No one at Nexus knew about his sister or the accident that left her in a coma. Panicked, he tried tracing the messages, but they always disappeared before he could find their source. The more he tried to ignore them, the more desperate the messages became. "They're closing in, Ethan. If you don't get me out, you'll be next." Ethan started sleeping less, haunted by dreams of dark corridors and faint whispers calling his name. He found himself obsessively watching the security feeds, convinced that he would find the stranger. But as days passed, he started noticing subtle shifts in the footage, faint reflections, walls seeming to twist slightly, doors where none had been before. It was as if the backrooms were alive, rearranging themselves. One night, as he scanned the feeds, a video call popped up on his monitor. The figure was back, and this time it spoke in a voice that was low, pleading. "Ethan, it's me, Will." Ethan's heart stopped. Will was his childhood friend, one he hadn't thought of in years. They'd grown up together, but Will had gone missing after high school. The police had ruled it an accident, but now, decades later, Ethan found himself staring into Will's hollow, terrified eyes. "Will." "How?" Ethan stammered. "They took me years ago. Nexus trapped me here. They use people, make us test subjects, let us rot in this endless place. But it's worse than that, Ethan. They're collecting souls, keeping us as part of this maze. I've seen people who vanished from Nexus. You might be next." Ethan's hands shook as he listened. He had always known Nexus had secrets, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. He had to help Will. Desperately, he accessed the mainframe, searching for any access point to free his friend. But every attempt was blocked by an unknown protocol, a system designed to keep the backrooms completely sealed off from the world. "Ethan," Will's voice crackled through the speaker. "They know you're helping me. You're running out of time." A loud banging echoed outside the door to his office, and Ethan froze. Through the window, he saw a pair of Nexus security guards approaching, their faces unreadable. His options were running out. In a moment of panic, he bypassed the firewalls, initiating an unauthorized emergency shutdown. The system flickered, the lights dimmed, and for a moment, the camera feeds cut out. Ethan held his breath. But as the lights came back on, he saw that Will was still there, his face now distorted and drained of hope. He whispered, "I can't escape, Ethan. They won't let us go. But now that you've seen me, they'll come for you too." The screen went black, leaving Ethan staring at his own reflection. Outside, the security guards were gone, but he knew they would return. And as he turned to leave, he caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye, a patch of peeling yellow wallpaper at the end of the hall.